This is Bob Benenson from cqpolitics, and we're presenting a short history of the National Party presidential conventions. The first convention was held in 1831, not by the Democrats and not by the modern Republican Party, but by something called the anti-Masonic Party. It was 1831, I guess you just had to be there. The Democrats held their first convention in 1832. And the Republicans, who were new on the political scene in the 1850s, held their first convention in 1856 and were pretty prodigious for a new political party, as just 4 years later, they nominated Abraham Lincoln at their convention in Chicago, and they elected him President of the United States. The conventions quickly established themselves as the decision-making body for the parties as they determined who their presidential and vice presidential nominees were going to be. Back then, the delegates really went through a process of multiple ballots before deciding on the presidential nominee in most of the conventions. And this reached its highest point, and maybe its most absurd point, in 1924 at the Democratic National Convention in New York City. It took 16 days and 103 ballots for the Democrats to decide upon a candidate named John W. Davis to be their nominee. Happy days are here again. The conventions continued in their mode of operation pretty much for the next few decades. Some of the highlights were in 1932 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic nominee, became the first presidential nominee to address a convention in person. Prior to that, the acceptance speeches were all delivered on paper and presented to the delegates by proxy. The 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago was really the event that changed everything as far as how we run our political conventions. Inside the convention hall, disagreements between party regulars, political insiders, some of the more conservative Democrats, and a new rising wing of the party, much more liberal, much more activist, broke out into really open arguments and disagreements.
With George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
This atmosphere really hurt the Democratic Party's chances of winning that November, and indeed, Vice President Hubert Humphrey wound up losing that election narrowly to Republican Richard Nixon. Coming out of 1968 and the chaos of that year, a group of reformists within the Democratic Party really created the modern convention, which is much less of a decision-making body and much more of a love fest. One of the first candidates to really effectively use the newfangled convention, the four-day infomercial, was Ronald Reagan when he first ran for president as the Republican nominee in 1980.
You're singing our song.
In 1988, Ann Richards, who was a Democratic official in Texas and went on to win the governorship, made a rip-roaring keynote speech that just lambasted the Republican nominee that year, the incumbent Vice President, George Bush.
I'm delighted to be here with you this evening because after listening to George Bush all these years, I figured you needed to know what a real Texas accent sounds like.
And in 2004, we had a prime example of how the conventions were increasingly used to showcase new upcoming talent within a political party.
Who oppose the war in Iraq, slice and dice our country into red states and blue states. Red states for Republicans, blue states for Democrats. But I've got news for them too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around in our libraries in the red states.
And Obama stepped onto the stage and introduced himself to the American public in a big way, making an electrifying speech of American values and Democratic Party values. Most of the conventions, of course, end in a great deal of hoopla. In 2004, John Kerry, the Democratic nominee, was joined on stage by a cast of hundreds of Democratic politicians and lawmakers and entertainers supporting the party, you would have thought that John Kerry was the most popular Democratic nominee in history. Of course, he went on to lose the general election by a small margin to President Bush.
I'm honored by your support, and I accept your nomination for President of the United States.
This year's conventions almost certainly will be just like the others of the modern era. The time will be tightly scripted, the candidates will be shown in their best light, and party unity will be the word of the day.